Hello and welcome to Merlin's Manor. Today I'm going to be giving my thoughts on Euphoria, Build a Better Dystopia, which is a game designed by Jamie Stegmaier and published by Stonemaier Games. I received a copy from Stonemaier Games to review. Now before we get into my thoughts on the game, I'm going to give a brief gameplay overview. The goal of the game is to be the first to place out all 10 of your stars. You'll start with 2 dice, which are your workers, and you can gain up to 4 workers. But each time you roll your workers, there'll be a knowledge test, which will combine the base knowledge number you have on the board, which starts at 3, and can go as low as 1 or as high as 6. Combine that with the numbers on all of the workers in your pool, not counting the ones that are already out on the board. And if your knowledge is 16 or higher, you'll lose your highest value worker. So having 4 workers is not always viable. The main mechanisms of the game are worker placement and resource management. You'll put your workers out in various locations to gain resources. Some of these areas you place workers will pool the value of all the workers that are there together, and you'll gain benefits based on the total value of all the workers there. If the value is between 1 and 4, you'll gain 1 resource and move the corresponding track up. Between 5 and 8, you gain 1 resource and lose a knowledge, which losing knowledge is generally a good thing, as you want to keep your workers dumb so they don't wise up and leave on you. And if the value is 9 plus, you gain 2 resources and gain a knowledge. In other spaces, you'll pay a resource to gain a benefit. On these spaces, if a player goes there while your worker is there, then that worker that you place gets bumped back to you, including if you choose to go there yourself. If you are out of workers on your turn, then you must spend your turn getting your workers back, and you have the choice between either feeding your workers or giving them a bliss in order to increase morale by 2, or to do nothing and decrease morale by 1. Morale represents how many item cards you can hold. Item cards are required to perform many of the actions that will gain you stars, and many of the spaces require 3 cards or 2 of the same cards, so you want to gain morale at some point to be able to gain more cards. Now, how do you place out your stars? At the beginning of the game, you are dealt 4 recruit cards and you choose 2 to keep. One of these cards starts face up, giving you an ability, and the other is face down, and will be flipped up once the track for that company reaches the second section from the end, or the minor on the corresponding track reaches this symbol. When the company track for your recruits reaches the end, you'll place a star on any recruits for that company. There are also additional bonuses you get once the track for the company advances to the first section and the second section if you have a revealed recruit for that company. Either an extra resource when gaining resources from the factory, or getting both bonuses when paying a resource at the company space where you would normally either gain a card or a resource. You also gain a dilemma card at the start of the game, and when you play the specific item card listed or any 2 item cards, you can choose to either gain a star by choosing the immoral side of the card, or you can choose the moral option, which will allow you to look at 2 new recruit cards and choose 1 to have a 3rd recruit card, which will stay face down until it can be flipped. Other ways to place out stars include going to one of the areas that show gaining a star bonus and discarding 3 item cards or 2 of the same item card to place out a star. Spaces to place these stars are limited to player count in each section, so there's a bit of a race to claim those spaces. The green area at the top has an additional way to place out stars where you pay 3 resources instead of cards. But there is still the same amount of open spaces for stars. You also put out stars if you were involved in spending resources to build a construction. When you place a worker on a construction space and pay the resource listed, your worker stays there until the construction is built, which happens when the amount of resources equal to the player count have been paid for that construction. Then all who paid resources place their star on the construction, and anyone who did not help build that construction will have a penalty until they go to that area's opportunities for placing a star and choose to place their star on that construction. These areas open up another way of placing out a star in that section of the game board instead of needing to discard 3 cards. These are the basics of how the game plays. There are more details I would go into if this were a full rules teach, but this should give you a gist of how the game plays. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the winner is the person who places out all 10 stars first. Now let's get into the game review itself, starting with art and components. First of all, I really like the game trays that are used to store the components, and while they recommend placing out the components on the board, I prefer to just leave them in the trays for quick setup and tear down. The components themselves are nice wooden components, custom dice with vibrant colors, a large player board, and a few decks of cards. I like how the player aids have a dual purpose, in the reverse side being your dilemma card. I do question the resource multiplier card. We never personally needed it in our 2 and 3 player games, but they would probably be useful at 5 player count. But starting with a 1 times seems very unnecessary, as you could just keep the resources off the card. And then that would open up to 2 times, 3 times, and 5 times on that card, or even just having larger spaces for 2 times and 3 times. The custom dice have a unique way of doing the pips, which adds to the game as well thematically. The quality of the components overall is good, as is typical for a Stonemaier game. The art fits very well with the theme, and while it's not an art style that personally draws me in, it is good and very appropriate for the game. The iconography on the board is very clear and helpful as well. Now let's talk about ease of play. I've placed this game at a medium complexity for learning to play. There are a few things that are complicated to wrap your mind around at first, and we even played one thing wrong our first time, but quickly realized our error and played it right from then on out, and that was that you only get a track bonus if you have a revealed recruit for that track. There are also a lot of locations to go to on the board, but many of them work in a very similar way to one another, just with different resources involved. I'd say there are also some aspects to the game that work in a bit of a unique way from what you might be used to in other worker placement games that contribute to a slightly more complex learning process. I will say that the iconography in the game is quite helpful in many places to help you know what to do, but a few of those icons do require a little interpretation at first, so it is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to how they help with the complexity in the game. Though once you've learned what they mean, they can be very helpful to remind you of some of the rules as well, such as the icon on the board that tells you that you can use 2 identical cards to equal the discard 3 cards, and the area that reminds you when you are gathering your workers back to discard a food or bliss to increase morale by 2, or just decrease morale by 1 if you choose not to feed or drug your workers. This game is not terribly complex, but I would not call it entry level either. Now let's get into the gameplay review itself. I like how the worker placement works in this game with the unique spots where you add up the numbers of all the dice there to determine the actions you get to take. There is sometimes a standoff where you are hoping the other player will go there first to add enough value that you can then take the highest value action with the dice that you have. Or if you want to do the lower value action multiple times to move the track, you're hoping to get 2 dice in there that add up to less than 5 before anyone else goes there, or else wait until others draw back their workers before you place your worker in that area. This makes for an interesting decision space and adds some tension to the game. I also like how the other spots work where workers can be bumped. You find yourself hoping that others bump you out of that place so that you can get an extra action before recalling your workers, while personally trying to hold off from bumping others and giving them that benefit. Trying to wait until they have to recall their workers before you go there. You can also personally bump your own worker, kind of gaming the system a bit if you're able and wanting to take that same action multiple times. The construction spots also add a bit of an extra dilemma in that you have to leave your worker there until the construction is completed, potentially leaving you down a worker for a few rounds while you wait for others to build up, or for you yourself to get the resources to build that up further. But as soon as it is completed, you do get immediately those workers back. Now, the feeding of your workers being optional in the game gives you some freedom and an interesting layer of strategy. Early game, you probably don't feel the need to feed your workers to save on actions while you don't need that additional morale to increase your hand limit, and then you'll spend turns getting your morale up, followed by allowing morale to slip as long as you don't feel that you need a hand limit of 5 or 6. There are also additional ways other than feeding workers to raise morale, so you don't feel the need to constantly feed your workers in this game, but only do it when it suits you. What a dystopian society you're managing here. I also like how the game encourages you to work on increasing on the track that's related to your recruit to gain extra benefits at locations related to that company, and to push down tracks for all supervisors you have to reveal them and their abilities, as well as to score stars for them by getting to the end of that track. And to a degree, this has become semi-cooperative, as multiple players may be trying to advance the same tracks, while at the same time trying to keep other tracks from advancing when you don't have a vested interest in those tracks like others may have. Now, I want to address the things I don't like so much about this game. First of all, I'm not a fan of the luck that is interjected with the knowledge tests. You can work hard to get that third worker, keep your knowledge low, even all the way down to 1, and still fail a knowledge test by rolling too high and lose your extra worker. Plus, there is hardly an incentive to have 4 workers unless you're planning to leave workers out on construction sites, because odds are pretty high that you're going to lose one of those workers on your next roll of all 4 workers. Though if someone does manage to roll low and keep all 4, that also seems a bit unfair as well, because you just know you probably wouldn't be so lucky in the situation. While the mechanic works on a thematic level, I just don't like the randomness it adds, where you can lose a worker, essentially wasting the time it took in gaining resources and getting that worker. I'm also not a big fan of the race to a goal type games in general. There are a few games that stand out that I do like, and overall I did not personally find this one to draw me in and get me as excited to race to the finish as a few of those other games. It's fine, but not exciting enough to keep me coming back. I also think the recruits are a bit unbalanced. Some seem very meh and require specific niche situations, while a majority seem to be just right, giving some minor benefits throughout the game, and then there were a few that seemed overpowered. In particular, one that made it cheap to go after stars from a company by reducing the cost to just 1 card instead of 3, basically making it so a player could easily run away with a quick 2 to 3 points, depending on player count, as it does at least cap at player count. Plus, once you get above 2 or 3 stars, others are likely to claim the remaining ones to block that person in higher player count games. In a race to 10 stars, this seems like a heavy advantage over getting extra resources in niche circumstances, or raising or lowering morale and knowledge, and the other smaller benefits from the other recruits. The ability does allow other players to gain a card, but if you gain 3 stars and others gain 3 cards over the course of those 3 stars, you're basically netting out 3 stars to 1 star that they're able to get. In the game I got that recruit, I was quick to take advantage of that ability and won the game by a few stars. With another ability, the game probably would have been a much closer game. Apart from a few overpowered recruit abilities, I have found the game to be a very tight game. In fact, the last game we played, I was on pins and needles for the last few rounds, not sure if I was going to make it before my wife in a 2-player game that we were playing, and I barely managed to get that final star, but it really could have gone to either of us. Overall, I find the gameplay okay, with some things that I really liked, but other areas that were not for me, with ultimately me not finding satisfaction with that race to 10 stars, and how that plays out not being fully satisfying for me. Now let's talk about replayability. There are quite a few different recruit abilities in the game that will provide some tweaks to gameplay, and 2 different ways to get new workers depending on what you are focusing on. But apart from that, a lot of the gameplay is very same from game to game, just depending on which factory you are focusing on, perhaps changing from game to game. There are also a decent number of constructions, and only 6 at play in any given game, but I didn't find the differences from one construction to the next to be that game-changing from game to game. It seems the biggest difference was the recruit powers, and going to be playing differently based on what those different recruits are, as well as playing differently based on what your opponents are doing. But even the various routes you can take don't seem to change things up that much, outside of choosing to focus more on building constructions versus getting stars from discarding cards. Overall, I personally found replayability for this game to be a little on the low side. Now let's talk about theme for a moment. The theme is a dark one, as you are basically hiring workers and trying to keep them dumb so that they don't wise up and leave this dystopian workforce that you have going on. The theme comes through in various ways throughout the game, including your moral dilemma card, recruit abilities, ways to increase and decrease morale, and of course the mechanic of trying to keep your workers dumb so that they don't leave. It's not really a theme I personally find the most engaging, but it does certainly come through strong throughout the game, especially as the game encourages you to toe that line between keeping your workers happy versus not caring to spend the resources to do so, as other things wind up being more important to winning the game. And let's get into my final thoughts. Let's get straight into my rating here. I was leaning towards a 6 out of 10 before our last game, which was the game that had the most tension to it down to the last turn. And I decided to settle in on a 6.5 out of 10. This game is okay, but ultimately not a game I see myself coming back to over and over again. If you really enjoy games that are a race to 10-point style games, then you may enjoy this one a bit more than I did. I did like the way worker placement works in this game, but ultimately did not find the win condition fully satisfying. Games with a race to win condition that I enjoy more include Tiny Epic Galaxies, My Little Scythe, and New York Zoo. Euphoria does a good job of incorporating the dystopian theme from the art to the gameplay itself, and the game has good components. While the losing of workers due to them gaining too much knowledge mechanic fits well with the theme, I did not like the randomness of rolling too high causing you to lose a hard-earned worker. And I also found a little issue with imbalance in the recruits, particularly the ones that made it easier to get stars either by discounting star actions or by giving more cards. I also personally felt like the game would feel too similar from game to game after a while, with the biggest change being found simply in the recruits, as even the construction seemed to only add minor tweaks to the gameplay. Overall, this game is a decent game, but just not one I will find myself coming back to regularly, which is why I rate it a 6.5 out of 10. I hope that this review has given you an idea of how this game plays and whether it is a game for you or not. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this video and we will check out some more of my videos. And until the next time, I hope you have a great week and keep on gaming.